This slide is showing the general structure of a vertebra, and there's a lot of different structures that all the vertebrae have in common. First of which is the body. The body is the anterior weight-bearing region, and it's much thicker in other regions, like the lumbar region, than the thoracic region, for example. The vertebral arch is going to consist of a couple things. It's this entire arch that we see going from here to here with this arrow. The vertebral arch consists of two pedicles and two lamina. The pedicles are these structures right here. So this is a pedicle and this is a pedicle. The lamina are located here. This is one lamina and this is one lamina. There are surgeries called laminectomies, which remove the lamina of the vertebrae. And what that does is reduce the pressure off of the spinal cord. When they remove both the lamina, they call that a bilateral laminectomy. The next common part of a vertebra is the vertebral foramen. And that enclosure is formed by the body and vertebral arch, and it's where the spinal cord is located. So remember, when you see foramen or foramina, you want to think hole. And this is a hole for a very large nerve, the spinal cord. Then there are intervertebral foramina, smaller holes, which are lateral openings between vertebrae for passage of spinal nerves. And we can't see them on this image, but we'll see them on the next one. But in order to see them, you'd have to look at a lateral image with one vertebra on top of another. So the vertebrae have 7 different processes. First of all, they have the spinous process, which is located posteriorly. So if you take a minute and put your thumb right on the back of your vertebrae, that point that you feel is your spinous process. Then there are 2 transverse process which project laterally. You cannot feel those. And then there are what we call articular processes above and below the vertebra. So in this specific area, we have what's called a superior articular process. And on the surface of that is a facet. The same over here. This would be the superior articular process, and on this surface would be the facet. The facet is very interesting because it forms a joint, and imagine a smooth joint from a superior vertebra. So this is going to represent one facet surface, and this is another facet surface. When those two interact, that forms a joint which allows you to lean forward and to lean back. Remember that song, Just Like Fat Joe, Lean Back? That's his facet joints that allow him to do that. Y'all are probably too young to remember that song. So now we get to the cervical vertebra. The cervical vertebra are C1 through C7. They're the smallest and the lightest of the vertebrae. And remember, C1 and C2 have their own name, the atlas and the axis. The axis has a part of it called the dens, and the dens is what allows the atlas to rotate. And it allows us to shake our head from left to right. C3 through C7 don't have any specific name, but they do have an oval shape to them. C7 spinous process is what's called bifid. It's kind of split like a forked tongue right here. It has a transverse foramen, and the transverse foramen is only in the cervical region. So there's blood vessels that run parallel to the cervical region of your spine. And then finally, C7 has the vertebra prominens, which you actually could feel it because it's kind of protrudes more to a point than C6 above it. So when we compare the different regions now, we have this nice chart that does that. First of all, the body of the cervical region is small and oval in C3 through C7. C2, the atlas and axis have no body. In the thoracic region, they're a little larger than cervical, and they have costal facets where the ribs attached. The lumbar is massive and kidney shaped because it's going to be responsible for maintaining the majority of the weight. The spinous process is short, bifid for C7. For thoracic, the spinous process is long, and the lumbar spinous process is short and blunt and projects directly posteriorly. The vertebral foramen is triangular in the cervical, circular in the thoracic, and triangular in the lumbar. The transverse process has foramina. For the thoracic, it bears facets for ribs except for T11 and T12, which are called the floating ribs. But it has no transverse foramina. And for the lumbar, they're thin and tapered, but again, no foramina. The superior and inferior articular processes have these facets on them. And the facets are synovial joints that, again, allow you to flex and extend, which we'll talk more about in the next chapter. The movements allowed in the cervical are flexion and extension, lateral flexion, rotation. For thoracic, you have a little bit of rotation, lateral flexion. And then for lumbar, you have flexion and extension because of those facet joints. When we look at the superior view of them, we can see for the cervical, you have a thin body. It gets bigger in thoracic, and it's thickest in the lumbar. We have the transverse foramen in the cervical. No transverse foramen, just a process in the thoracic and lumbar. The vertebral foramen is going to look a little bit different in each section. And there are the transverse processes, which I've already mentioned. And then there are the processes with facets on them, which allow them to articulate with the one above or below it. And then protruding posteriorly that you can feel in the back of your spine are these spinous processes. When we look at the lateral view of them, we see the spinous processes first. Notice how they look a little different. And one way to identify them, especially in the lab, is that the spinous process for a thoracic vertebra looks like a giraffe. And for the lumbar, it looks like a moose and has the thickest body. We also you can see the thickness of the body really well in this row. We have the transverse processes and the transverse process here, again with a foramen. And then you can see the other processes on those vertebrae. So for lecture, make sure that you know the difference between the different regions of the vertebral column.